Here he comes.
Jaxon. The summer sales grow. Trying to sell you solar.
He one wheels on up to your door, and because you've been pretty curious about whether solar might make sense for your house, you hear the kid out. Just as you're dreaming of setting the thermostat to 68 all summer, he hands you his iPad with the quote, $35,000. So you send Jaxon one-wheeling on down the street, but that gets you thinking, is it possible for me to install my own solar? And how much would it save me?
I'm Nils, and what you just saw was my actual story, except for that Jaxon quoted me $78,000 for my setup, which I proceeded to then do on my own, DIY, for just $33,000. That's right, I saved $45,000 in 8 days of labor versus going with a door-to-door sales company. That's a savings of $5,625 per day of labor that I put in myself. The average door-to-door salesman is going to charge somewhere in the neighborhood of $35,000 to $45,000 for a system big enough to cover the average US home's electric bill. That same setup will cost you a little over $15,000 if you do all the work yourself. I'll start by showing you how I purchased all of the equipment from a company that figures out every component I need for my system and even handles all of the permits and the paperwork. And then after they've done all that, they have it all delivered right to my door, ready to install. They also provide step-by-step instructions for the entire installation. And in addition to that, they offer full phone tech support for the entire process, start to finish. I chose to go the DIY route because, well, you know, I love power tools and I love solar. And I also wanted to show that this is something that most homeowners can accomplish. This is something that if you do yourself, you're gonna be very familiar with every aspect of the system so that you can do upgrades or anything that you want in the future, and it helps you have total confidence in what you've done. I've broken this video down into 4 main sections, and you can use the chapters at the bottom of the video to skip around to whatever interests you most. First, we're gonna talk about how to get the components, the permits, and the instructions. Second, we'll cover how not to DIY this, but still save tons of money. Third, we'll talk about how and why to DIY this entire process, start to finish, giving you the most savings of any of the options we'll cover. Fourth, and finally, we'll talk a little bit about my system and how that's set up and what this will look like going into the future. So next year, the year after, and what all of that's gonna look like as far as savings, as well as far as the production of energy here at my house. I chose to work with a company called Solar Wholesale. Now, I've seen these guys around for several years now, and I love what they're doing for homeowners. Basically, they provide a ready-to-install DIY solar kit for you, and it's all at a very reasonable price. And as part of that, they'll actually do all of the engineering work for you and even pull the permits in your local city. First, you hop on their website and you provide them with some information, including some information about your power bills, the electric company that you work with, and some of your personal preferences for your solar setup. Next, they come back to you with a quote with multiple options, like with and without battery backup, for example, and then you decide what makes the most sense for you and if you want to move forward. If you decide to proceed, you take some pictures and get some measurements and submit all of that online. They need some basic roof measurements as well as pictures of your meters, your attic space, and a photo of each corner of your house. Next, using that info, they engineer a full power and solar plan for you, complete with the schematics and everything you need specific to your install. They'll then take all of that information and submit it to your city to obtain a permit. Once the permit gets approved, they then arrange delivery of all of the product to your house, and they give you everything. I'm talking the panels, the inverters, accessories, all of the schematics, everything you need. You will have to provide some of your own power tools to do that, but that's just a good excuse to pick up some more of your own. But most of the ones you'll need are completely basic ones that you probably already have. This means that without having to do weeks or even months of research into all of the minutia and the details of this, you can get all of the panels and the inverters and the components and even down to the exact amount of wiring that you need for your particular install without worrying about any of that homework and digging into all of this. After learning about them, I got in touch with them and I was able to partner with them to offer you, all of my viewers, $1,500 off any system that you purchase with them. So just by using the link in the description below or the QR code on screen here, you can save 15 of these beautiful bills. Speaking of beautiful bills, you may have heard that at the end of 2025, this big beautiful bill that's been passed is going to make it so that the 30% federal tax credit for solar installs is going to go away. Now, with that in mind, Solar Wholesale has told me that they are actually going to be compensating for that and marking down their prices in order to be able to make up for that difference. So whether you're watching this in 2025 or later, you're still going to get that amazing price. In fact, they've been building up their inventory this whole time in anticipation of when this federal tax credit goes away. So obviously, solar wholesale is the first ingredient in this recipe to save thousands or tens of thousands of dollars on your solar install. A big thanks to them for sponsoring this video. Now, with my channel being called Learn to DIY, of course, I was going to want to install this whole thing myself. Now, that is not what everybody is going to want to do. The average system is going to take maybe 4 to 6 days. A larger system like ours is going to take longer. So we installed an 18 kilowatt system, and I actually had the help, at least up on the roof, of my son, Anders, and then I came down and did the rest myself. And that project took us about 8 days altogether. So I get it, this is not for everybody. Some people will look at this and say, no way am I doing that. I totally understand. There is a bit of a hack here. So here's what you can do. You can actually start with the first step that we just went through. You contact Solar Wholesale, you get the exact system that you need, go through the pictures, go through the measurements, everything like that. Then you can work with an electrician or a solar contractor to do the full install. You don't have to wire a single thing yourself. They're going to end up charging you a whole lot less because Solar Wholesale did so much of the work that they would normally have to do. All of that prep work that they normally have to do on a job is already done, already taken care of, and the materials are literally sitting in your driveway ready to go. So that saves them a ton of work, and all they have to do is the physical install. I ran some scenarios to find out what the average US home consumes as far as electricity and what kind of a system they would need to replace their electrical bill. So a 7.4 kilowatt system would be sufficient to replace the average homeowner's total electric bill every month. Now, I ran some numbers there. If you were to actually hire out a master electrician to do that work, and I'm consulting my notes here, you're likely looking at about $3,400 for labor. Now, if you went as high as working with maybe a full solar contracting company, then you're looking at maybe $5,200 for something like that. And that does depend on several factors like where you are in the country, how high your roof is, what your steep or what your slope or pitch of your roof is, all that sort of thing. So all of that comes into play, but you're usually looking at less than $5,000 for the install. That means that that same system that the door-to-door sales guy wants to charge you $35,000 for is probably going to cost you around $13,000 roughly for the actual parts and the permits and everything that Solar Wholesale provides, plus call it $4,000, maybe even $5,000 for the actual install and the labor. So that's putting you at $17,000 or $18,000 versus $35,000. It's about half the price, which is pretty amazing. For the average homeowner, that means that you're going to replace all of your electric bill and pay it all off in under 7 years. That's pretty cool. And the best part is you didn't have to lift a finger for any of it. Now, to keep apples compared to apples, if you took that same 35 grand that you'd pay from the door-to-door guy and you actually applied the 30% tax credit there, then you're still looking at a probably about 14.5-year payoff on something like that, because you're down to $24,500. But let's compare that $24,500 versus $11,900 with just a few hours of work. I mean, I think that's pretty darn worth it. Obviously, my intent here though is to help you see if it makes sense for you to DIY this project. So in that same scenario above where the average home bill is involved, you're looking at about $13,000 for the actual product itself. And then with that, you still get your 30% on top of that. So that brings us down to $9,100. And that's starting to feel way more within reach for most people, especially knowing that they could pay off their electric bills permanently with that. At that cost, this system will pay for itself in less than 6 years. It's actually 5 years and 4 months. So if you think you're going to live in your house for 6 years or more, this is kind of a no-brainer, especially if you have the ability to do this yourself. One of the best parts about this is that not only are you going to understand every aspect of the system that you've just installed, but if you do decide to upgrade, maybe you want to put a battery in later, maybe you want to put an additional battery, maybe you want to add some panels with microinverters, you'll know how to do that because you've been through the process and you'll know how to do it in the most efficient and effective way possible. One thing worth mentioning here is I've been working on building out an entire course that shows several different methods and different types of installs that you can use to install solar in your home. My goal here is to make it really easy for you to see scenarios that are very similar, if not the same, as what you would use. We're talking with batteries, without batteries, with microinverters versus string inverters, anything that you use, big systems, small systems. We're going to show you some kits that are very similar to what you would need, exactly how to install them, and more importantly, I've worked with professional solar installers to show you all of the little hang-ups that we tend to run into as DIYers and how you can avoid those. I'll walk you through all of those questions that you're going to have as a first-time solar DIY installer, and I'll also show you some of the tips and tricks that the pros use to save you tons of time and tons of money. Speaking of saving money, of course you're going to save a ton by DIYing this, but I'll show you what tools you need, what tools you don't need, and how to make the most of your investment. Now, of course, I want to make sure that you feel completely confident in this, so if you are unsatisfied in any way with this, I offer a 100% money-back guarantee. And if you want to learn more about this, you can check out the QR code on screen, or again, links in the description below. Feel free to check that out at any time, even if you're just curious and want to learn a little bit more, but this will help you as I hold your hand step by step through every step of the process. Most solar energy systems are set up one of two ways: microinverters or string inverters. So microinverters are small inverters like this that connect to anywhere from 1 to 4 panels. They often provide monitoring for the power output of each of the panels, and their job is to convert the DC power that the panels generate into AC power that you can use in your home. They usually pass power down to your house via Romex or THHN cable, the same stuff that's used all over your house interior and exterior already. String inverters take all of the DC power from all of the panels together, or at least in strings of them, and convert it all into AC power in one unit. Now that unit is usually located at the ground level, and the power is brought into it using what's called PV or photovoltaic wire, or sometimes high voltage metal shielded cables like these, which is what I ended up using. In both cases, the power can optionally be run to a battery or just to a disconnect switch and then to your main service panel. Your power company needs to install a new meter in most cases, one that allows you to feed power back to the grid instead of just allowing you to take power from the grid. Most power companies do this free of charge. So to recap, DC power from your panels gets converted to usable AC power either through microinverters or through a string inverter, and it's then fed either into a battery or to the grid. In most cases, you have the option to use the power directly as it's being produced or to let the power company save it and then you pull it from the grid. Much of the install in any of these scenarios is very similar. I have one of the more complex systems that you can buy, so if you can follow along with what you see here today, yours is likely going to be even easier. Another thing to keep in mind is that you always have the option to do a ground-mounted solar array. This is much easier to access and work with, obviously, but it does require more land. I, like many of you, just don't have the room in my yard for this, so a roof-mounted system it is. So let's head up to the roof. If you're working on the roof, there are a few things we need to cover first. Ladder safety and roof safety being principal among them. Here are a few tips to try to help keep you safer on a ladder. With ladders, there are three main things, and I use the acronym FAT to remember them. F is for footing. Make sure the ladder's footing is secure and not in a place that it has a risk of slipping. A is for angle. You should be able to stand at the base of the ladder with your toes touching it. If you reach out your hands, they should be at just the right distance to grab a ladder rung. If the rung is too close, pull that footing back. If it's too far, move the ladder closer to the house. The T stands for top. The top of the ladder should have 2 to 3 rungs above the connection point with the roof, the gutter, or whatever it's leaning against. That gives us enough room to grab onto the ladder, but not so much that it throws off the balance of the ladder. If you stick with these 3 principles, you'll be much safer on the ladder. As for the roof work, I highly recommend using a harness system. You can buy a roof harness set in a bucket for about $100. Each set has ropes, carabiners, and a strap set like this that can be connected to the roof to keep you safe wherever you are. You can manually adjust the amount of rope available so that you're never too loose or too tight. These are a pain in some ways, but if you have a steep slope at all, or if you're working high off the ground, these could literally save your life. You'll see in this video that we weren't perfect about using the harness system, but we used it whenever there was nothing else to stop us and based on our comfort levels. I highly recommend, however, that you use the harness system anytime you're on the roof. The roof work breaks down into the following parts: layout and feet, mounting and rails, running wire, the solar deck, panel wiring, and panel installation. Now that said, we did have one major obstacle preventing us from getting started. That is the old solar panel system. Now I'll keep this brief since most of you won't have to worry about this, but we had a door-to-door sales company install an 8 kilowatt system on our house about 9 years ago. Unfortunately, not only did they do a mediocre job on it, but the string inverter they provided stopped working after about 8 years. In addition, the size of the system simply hasn't kept up with our power needs, as our power needs have grown. The new system we're going to install is more than twice as big, so I decided to take this one down and see if we can get the inverter repaired or buy a new one if we have to,
and then we'll put these panels to use on a future project that we're planning right now. The process of taking down our old panels, pulling the PV wire out, removing the inverter and disconnect, and getting back to a clean state took about a day for us. We started this on a Tuesday morning and we were done by Tuesday evening. Just as a point of reference, I did find out that having this removal service done by a door-to-door company would typically run you about $5,000. Again, super glad we did this ourselves, and this feels like a great time to talk about one of our secret weapons too, the scissor lift. By the way, I highly recommend this little beast right here. This scissor lift cost, the exact amount for us was $532 for 1 week rental, and that includes having it delivered right here to our driveway, picked up afterward, taxes, fees, everything. So 532 bucks. And I will say we found that on the local classifieds. Here where we live in Utah, there's a website that's pretty popular. Facebook Marketplace is going to be great for that sort of thing, or maybe even Craigslist. So look there, because when we looked at the rental places, it was about twice as much. So check that out. This is an electric one, so it's really easy to manage, easy to work with, and we're only going up to right there. So it's not that big a deal to have it go up that high. So, but this has already been a lifesaver and well worth it to have all of the solar panels come over to here instead of on our shoulder, around the top of the ladder, down the ladder every time. We did a few of those, that's great, but if you can do a scissor lift, then it's gonna definitely be worth the money that you pay to do that. The plans that Solar Wholesale sends show the entire layout for every panel on your roof. If you're lucky like me, you can put them all on one south-facing roof. Now my system consists of 5 rows that are as many as 11 panels across. You'll also notice that mine are mounted in the landscape orientation. Yours might be in portrait orientation as well, whatever works best for your roof. In your photos and measurements that you provided to Solar Wholesale earlier, you likely will have indicated where any obstructions are on the roof, like turtle boxes, plumbing vents, chimneys, satellite dishes, etc. Now is the time to verify that everything is lined up as it should. In my case, for example, I discovered towards the end that I had provided the wrong measurement for this flue here, but it turned out to be okay since I just needed to bump a panel up a bit higher. Our next step is to use a measuring tape and the provided wax crayon to start laying out where the rails need to go. This is completely optional, but right now is a great time to snap a chalk line where each joist is as well. By doing this, you save yourself a lot of figuring out as you move around the roof. You can mark each joist and then use the wax crayon to indicate the intersection of a joist with each rail. And this makes the mounting process even faster. As far as how to determine where the rails will go, there's one major rule to consider, and that is the 1/3 rule. All rails or feet should be located within no more than 1/3 of the width or length of the panel. Let's say this panel is 6 foot by 3 foot for simplicity's sake. The rails running across it need to be within 1 foot of the edge, since that's 1/3 of its width. There also needs to be a foot within 2 feet of the edge of the short side, since that's 1/3 of the length of it. The rails themselves should actually extend past the edge of the panel by 1 to 2 inches, but the foot can't be more than 1/3 of the width in. With that in mind, you can start to figure out the exact locations of the panels and, subsequently, the rails. Another thing to consider here is that we would ideally want as many of our feet to be mounted in a staggered pattern as possible. Rather than mount all of our feet every other joist, every 48 inches, it's better to offset certain rows so that we're distributing the load, like you see here. I did my best to do that in our layout. Now when it comes to the feet themselves, these are what are called snap and rack speed seal deck feet. They're incredibly convenient because they actually can be mounted anywhere on the roof, not just on the joist. If you do connect with a joist, you only need to drive 2 screws in, these 2 vertical ones here. If you miss, however, you can just drive in the other 2 screws and you're all set. This is super convenient and prevents a whole lot of re-drilling. So my advice here is to mark and check each joist, drive in your feet, and if you don't feel like you actually hit the joist, which you can usually tell by how much torque it takes to drive it in, then use the other 2 screws. If you do hit the joist, you're good to stick with the 2 original screws only. Another consideration for feet is that we want to avoid having the foot mounted in between courses of shingles. The entire foot should be on one course whenever possible. With this in mind, it's okay to move the entire line up or down a bit so long as it stays within our 1/3 rule. On several of my lines, I had to either move all of the feet up or just flip the feet around to make sure they stayed in one course. I highly recommend getting a light colored chalk for your chalk line. Amazon actually sells white chalk powder for about 12 bucks that can be incredibly helpful here. I ended up doing red and it worked, but a lighter color would have been a lot easier to see. Another note on the chalk line is that you can actually wedge the end of the chalk line into the trim of your roof to hold it in place, making it pretty easy for one person to snap all of the lines. With your lines marked and your feet driven in, it's now time to seal the feet. Now, Solar Wholesale provides a bunch of tubes of this outdoor-rated black sealant called M1. There are vents in the back of each foot. The manufacturer actually recommends that you squeeze the sealant into a small mound at the end of the 4 screw hole locations from the bottom. Then when you attach it to the roof, it should ooze out the vents. What most installers will do, however, is to install all of the feet at the same time and then go around to each of them and squeeze the sealant into each of the 3 vents to seal them all off. Between the rubber washer on the lag bolt, the plastic seal on the foot, and the sealant that you apply, this keeps everything nice and watertight. It also makes the install process a whole lot faster, since you're not having to load up every single foot with sealant, which is a real mess. When driving the screws, make sure to drive them just to the point where the rubber washer makes contact and begins to mushroom just a bit. If you overdo it, you'll break the washer and it won't be watertight. If you underdo it, it won't form a full seal. Speaking of driving the screws, Solar Wholesale provided both a socket adapter and a 1/2-inch socket driver that you can use to drive all of these. I highly recommend using the impact driver, which will be your best friend through this entire process. With all of the feet in place, it's time to put the rails up. Now this part is actually pretty easy overall. The rails are made of aluminum, so they're easy to work with. Start by placing one end of a rail down and snap into the foot mount. Remember that we want to leave about 1 to 2 inches of overhang on the end of the panels. Make sure that overhang is consistent up and down your rows. The rails should snap pretty easily into each of the feet mounts and should be fairly loose. When you get to the end of a rail and need to put another in, you can leave a gap of about 1/8 of an inch for expansion and then mount the next rail. We'll come back with a splice in just a bit to shore those 2 rails up. When you need to cut a rail, you can use standard woodworking tools such as a circular saw, but the goal is to use a high-tooth blade. I use this standard circular saw with a speed square and a 40-tooth blade, and it worked great every time. If you happen to have access to a portable metal bandsaw, that works great too. I carried a white marker with me to make these lines and mark whatever it is that I needed to cut. At this point, we're not really worrying about fastening down any of the rails to the feet, we're just getting everything in place. When you have all of the rails in place, it's then time to level the rails. This process is how we help to ensure that the panels all look even and flat next to one another after they're installed, regardless of how flat the roof itself is. The process is pretty simple. Start in one corner and raise both of the rails in that row to their max height and tighten them down. Then skip a foot and move to the next foot and do the same thing. What you're doing here is lifting these up as high as they can go, which allows both for better ventilation underneath and less of a chance of the wires touching the roof. And then you can go to the in-between feet mounts and tighten them wherever it is that they're sitting at that time. This allows all of the rails to self-level somewhat. Now you want to continue this process of lifting and tightening every other foot mount, then coming back and tightening the ones in between. Do this row by row until the rails are completely secure and fastened tightly to every single foot. This gets us up to a spot where we can pretty safely walk on the rails or put pressure on them as needed. Once you have your layout done and your rails in, it's time to decide where your solar deck is going to be mounted. The solar deck is basically a rooftop junction box. This is the box that takes all of the electrical wires from your panels and runs them down into the house. You'll want to find a spot that sits under a panel, but not under a rail. When you have that spot, I would at least drill a hole large enough to pull whatever wires are necessary to feed up to the roof. In my case, it was 4 metal-clad wires, so I made a hole about 1.5 inches wide. You'll also need to determine in your garage or other location exactly where your floor-level equipment will be mounted. In my case, I knew I needed the battery, the gutter on top of it, and the inverter above that. I decided to put them all right here, which meant I needed to run the wires all the way down through the ceiling roughly above that space. I drilled 4 holes big enough to pass the MC cables through, plus 1 small hole for the Ethernet wire, which we'll talk about in just a minute. I then used a 100-foot measuring tape to get a rough measurement of how long each run of MC cable needed to be by measuring from the holes in the attic, around the joists, and up to the hole in the roof where they needed to come out in the solar deck. I gave myself a few extra feet on either end and then proceeded to cut the MC cable to length so that I could feed it through. The plans called for a junction box to be right up against the ceiling in the garage, so the wires only had to be long enough to stick out about a foot on either side. Now this part was no fun. Pulling the wires up and through the attic is always messy and hot, especially in the summer. I did shed a few pounds in the process, but I eventually got it done. Now there are a few things to keep in mind during this process. Number one, you do need to use the provided stickers to identify the wire as being PV or solar powered wire, and those stickers should wrap around the bundle of cords every 4 feet. Number two, you're also going to need to secure the wires to the joists every 4 feet. I used an electrical staple that was provided by Solar Wholesale, pounded that into the joists, and then zip tied the wires to the staple, and then wrapped that whole thing with a sticker. Between the staples, zip ties, and the stickers, the wires should be both secure and obvious to anyone who sees them or works up there in the future. Now again, this is hot and sweaty work, so I highly recommend doing this in the early morning if you can. With the rails in and the wire coming up to the roof, we can now install the Solodeck box. A lot of solar array installs leverage microinverters. If that's the case for you, the microinverters use trunk cables that connect multiple microinverters together and pass their power down into the house via the Solodeck, typically using Romex cable. If your panels instead connect to a string inverter like mine, with or without optimizers, you'll still pass both ends of each string into the Solodeck and then connect them to either PV wires or metal-clad wires where they'll go down to the house. In both scenarios, you'll also need to wire a ground into the ground bus bar for the Solodeck, along with all other grounds in the box. The Solodeck has a house shape and should be inserted under a course of shingles, which can be cut to the shape of the Solodeck simply by tracing the lid with a crayon and then cutting it out. We'll talk more about the wiring inside here momentarily. One important thing to note here is that right now, while you're wiring up the Solodeck, is the best time to identify your positive and negative wires. You should be consistent with the colors of wire that you connect to positive versus negative. For example, if you connect all of your positive wires to red, or white if you only have black, white, and green, then you can keep that pattern going down into the house or the garage, and that'll make it easy to know what's what. If you're not certain what's positive and what's negative, or haven't kept track, you can use a multimeter to quickly determine polarity. Set your multimeter to DC, assuming these are strings, or AC if it's using microinverters, and then connect both your black and your red or white leads to each of the 2 PV wires for a string. If the resulting number is positive, like 300 volts for example, then the wire touching the red lead is the positive wire. If it's negative, like negative 300, then the wire touching the black lead is the positive. Regardless of which is which, connect the positive PV wire to the red or white wire going to the house. This will help keep everything straight down below, knowing that black is always the negative wire. Every solar panel comes with a positive and a negative MC4 connector like this. Now these may vary in length, but they're typically going to be about 1 meter long. These connectors are industry standard for solar arrays. You want to buy an MC4 disconnect tool before you get started, because you'll most likely need to disconnect at least one of these at some point. Solar Wholesale does not include one of these, so I ordered some online, but I wouldn't be surprised if they include these in the future because they are pretty relevant. The MC4s are watertight, and you're going to have to wire up a few of these yourself for most installs. Each trunk line or string line needs to go into the Solodeck. Whether your plans call for microinverters or for a string inverter, Solar Wholesale will specify how they're all laid out on the roof and what connects to what. Now keep in mind, you're free to move things around as it makes sense for your layout. Where my plan has 4 strings, each with 11 panels, we felt like the plan provided worked really well, and we went off of that. I even went into Photoshop to create a larger, more colorful guide than the one that I was provided, since this was essentially our map for what to connect where. You can see here we have strings 1, 2, 3, and 4, and they all connect both ends, the positive and the negative, into the Solodeck. Solar Wholesale sent a huge spool of PV wire, which is the kind of wire that's meant for carrying DC electricity. They also provided several MC4 connectors in both male and female options. It was then my job to connect a male or female connector to the PV wire that connected each end of the string and run it back to the Solodeck. So for example, if I have a female MC4 connector coming out of the first panel of the first string, I need to connect a male MC4 connector to some PV wire and then run that wire back to the Solodeck. I do the same thing with the last panel in the string, just connecting the opposite MC4s. Now putting an MC4 on PV wire isn't tough, but it does require a cable crimper. These are readily available at most hardware stores, or they can be purchased online for about $15 to $30. Here's how to connect the MC4 connectors. Start by trimming the PV wire about a 1/2 inch back. Now, most people don't have a 6-gauge wire stripper because they're very uncommon and they're pretty hard to find, honestly. You can actually just use wire strippers and spin those around, being really careful not to cut into the copper strands. Once you've got that 1/2 inch of insulation pulled off, you can then feed it into the pin. You're going to see the little arms or flaps that are available there, and make sure that the ends of the crimpers actually line up so that they'll curve under. We want them to push into each other right in the center of the copper wire. I also found it easiest to actually put the metal pin into the crimper first and get it lined up, and then feed the copper wire into it. The crimpers use a ratcheting motion to crush that into place, and then you should end up with something like this. Once the pin is connected to the copper wire, you can slide in the rear threaded portion as well as the main body of the connector, and then thread them together nice and tight. These will form a watertight connection that you can use to connect to the adjoining MC4 connector. Even with all of our positive and negative wires figured out, we're still missing one important ingredient, and that is the ground. A ground wire is provided, and it does need to be connected to at least one of the rails from each row, including those that are kind of off on their own. The grounds have their own special clamps for the rails, and they're pretty easy to work with. Now remember, the ground wires do not have to connect everything to everything else. They just need to ensure that every panel is somehow tied in. And we also need to remember that the frames of the panels are metal and act as part of that ground. For example, this one up on its own can just tie into the row beneath it, and that's all that's needed there. Same with this loaner over here on the other side. Then, as long as each of the main rows are connected, one of them can feed into the Solodeck, and we're good. I'd recommend connecting all of your grounds to all of the rails before putting any of the panels on. This ensures that you don't forget to do this and have to remove panels in order to connect grounds. One thing to be aware of is to try to be sure to put the ground connectors in a place where they'll sit comfortably underneath a panel, ideally in the middle. You don't want to have to remove and replace the ground because it turns out you put it right where the frame of a panel needs to go. Now speaking of tying into the Solodeck, here's how that works. Solar Wholesale provides these large 3-wire watertight connectors called strain reliefs that pinch down the wires as you tighten them. It's your job to drill holes into the box for each one, since every setup is a little bit different. So here I'm using a combination of a panel hole drill set and a step drill to drill those holes. I found that the step drill was actually easier, even though it did make more of a mess. The hole you need to drill should be just big enough to allow the strain relief to fit in, and then you can use the included locking nut to secure it in place. Inside each strain relief there are 3 holes that can be punched out. Now these are all plugged by default in case you don't need to use them. For the PV wire, you'll want to pass the entire shielded PV wire into the Solodeck and then strip it once it's in the box. It's a whole lot easier if you cut that PV wire at a 45-degree angle in order to thread it through. For the ground, it doesn't have insulation, so you can just pass it through any one of the holes. In my case, I had 4 strain reliefs because of my 4 strings. Each strain relief had a positive PV cable and a negative PV cable passed into it, insulation and all. On one of them, however, I used the 3rd hole, which was empty, to pass in the ground as well. And that's really all the wiring you're going to need to do on the roof for most installs. That said, if you do have optimizers on your panel, you're going to need a way to communicate with them. For that, you'll need to run an Ethernet cable, the same one I mentioned before, from the roof to the inverter, just like the electrical wires, though you may want it in a different spot. So my kit called for what are called TIGO optimizers, which come with a transmitter and a CCA. The transmitter goes up on the roof and the CCA goes down by the inverter. The transmitter is typically mounted onto one of the panels and it connects to the Ethernet wire that we mentioned earlier. It gets sealed up nice and tight and lives up there forever. The transmitter has to be placed within 30 feet of each panel, which is why I chose to place mine near the top middle of the array. Its job is to talk with each of the optimizers and then to transmit data back and forth from them to the CCA down below. The CCA connects to your Wi-Fi and makes all of the data available in the TIGO app. With that, you're able to see the production stats of every panel, which is pretty awesome. The optimizers do several things, but their 2 biggest jobs are to make sure that the series connected panels function more like a parallel group. That means that if there's shade on one of the panels, the others can still produce power and pass it along. The optimizers are also responsible for controlling rapid shutdown if necessary. So if, for example, the system needs to be deactivated instantly for safety purposes, the optimizers are going to handle that. If you're using microinverters, which many of you will be, you don't have to worry about the optimizers or TIGO setup. Okay, now for the fun part, the actual panel installation. It's time to make your solar array look like a professional did it. It's best to start on the bottom corner of the array. In my case, we started on the bottom left. We'll take our time setting this one up so that all of the other panels will follow suit. Now remember, we have a fair bit of leeway on our placement thanks to the 1/3 rule, so we can be a little off and it'll still look great. That said, if we do a good job on this first panel and keep every other panel tight against it, we'll end up with a beautiful install. Now for this first panel, we need to first determine if it's the last panel in a string or not, and whether we have a microinverter mounted to it or not. Once you've determined that, you can either mount the microinverter, mount the optimizer on it, or leave it alone. Remember that if you're using either optimizers or microinverters, you need to create a map of where each panel is on the roof and record the serial number onto that map. In most cases, you can just peel the sticker off of the inverter or optimizer and put it on the map like we're doing here. This will be crucial for monitoring the status of each panel and identifying each one later. I just used the flap from one of the cardboard boxes they provided to draw a pretty crude little map and then put the stickers on that. In my case, we were actually almost perfect at it, but we did forget one little sticker. Now luckily it was at the top left, so it wasn't too tricky to get to, although we did mount the optimizer on the bottom of that panel, which made it a little more difficult. We did find out from the installers that there's a little bit of a hack to how you can access that serial number. I've got my phone on a selfie stick and it's front-facing camera, and then on my watch I can see what it sees, and I can also take a picture from my watch. So, okay, I think I got some photos there. Let's find out. Oh, look at this. Ah, there we go. Okay, there's our number. So that works great. And now I've got all the numbers. That was the only one I was missing. I highly recommend putting your inverters or optimizers in place before you even bring the panels up to the roof, because it's kind of a big deal to forget those. So make sure to double check regularly that you didn't forget anything. For the first panel, you're going to need 4 clamps, 2 end clamps and 2 mid clamps. Snap and Rack uses clamps like these, but even if yours are different, the process is going to be nearly the same. Start by placing your end clamps into the end of the rails, 1 in each. Now these end clamps have a little Tyvek tail on them that you can use to pull the clamps onto the frame of the panel. So start with the end clamps several inches in, maybe 5 or 6 inches, with the tail sticking out. Then, once the panel has been placed on the rails and squared up, pull the tails until the clip grabs onto the frame of the panel. Use a 1/2 inch socket on an impact driver, our best friend here, to tighten down the bolt. You want to do the same with the other rail as well. You should be able to test that the panel is securely in place at this point. It's up to you if you want to tear off the tails now or wait. I chose to wait because I didn't want to not have them if I needed to move the panel later or reinstall it. When you're ready to remove the tails, simply yank up or down on them away from the rail and they'll tear off. You can also choose now to add the plastic end caps or do that later. And again, I decided to wait on that until the end of the job. When it comes to aligning the first panel, we're looking to make sure it's parallel to the roof line, parallel to the rails, and securely in place. This can largely be done by eye. It worked out pretty well for us on our first try. Now that we have one side fastened down, it's time to add the mid clamps. Now these can be inserted diagonally into the rails, and then you pull up on them to clip them into place. Scoot them up to the existing panel, and that's typically all we're going to do for now, because we also need to leave it loose enough to slide in the next panel. We also need to consider cable management. Solar Wholesale included a big bag of these zip ties with metal grips to help us keep everything tidy. Cables and wires underneath your solar panel array have to be at least 1 inch off the roof so that they don't get blown around or worn through by the harsh shingles. A common way to help with this is to tie either 1 or 2 knots in each wire to take up any slack. This can be tricky to get right though, because you need to make sure there's enough wire to reach the next panel to connect to, but it does get easier as you go. Also, that's where the zip ties come in. After each panel is in place, reach under the panel and check to make sure there's nothing loose underneath. If there is, panels have these small holes punched into the frame on the bottom that are designed to be able to fasten wires or other components to, especially with these zip ties. Pull them tight against the frame, zip tie them on, and then cut off the tail of the zip tie. When your panel is in place, you've checked that the inverter or optimizer is on, and you've recorded the serial number onto your map. The last thing to do is to double check the wiring configuration one last time to make sure you've got it right. Make sure you've confirmed if it's one of the middle panels in a series or a string, or if it's the first or last one, so that you know where the positive and negative wires are going to connect to. Once that's taken care of, it's time to install the next panel. Simply butt the panel up against the mid clamps and then connect the two wires together. Take care of any slack that might be there, and then run through the rest of your checklist too. Optimizers or inverters, stickers or serial numbers, loose wires, and making sure you understand the map and have everything wired correctly. Then once it's all looking good and is aligned vertically, fasten down the mids. These, just like everything else, just use the 1/2-inch socket with your impact driver. Keep working your way to the side, checking all of the requirements for each panel and keeping them all lined up. If you see that the row is looking a little crooked or off in any way, you do have the option of leaving a small gap in between one of the mid clamps to adjust for that. You can also lower or raise the foot mounting bolts if you need to, but this is usually more of an issue on subsequent rows. Ideally, you want to make sure that each of them is sitting at approximately the same level. The rest of the bottom row is a wash, rinse, repeat process. Remember that you can tuck your wires into the channel of the rails and run a zip tie around the rack to make sure that they're going to stay there. Whether early on or later, you're likely going to have to run a diagonal connection between two panels that are kitty corner from one another. There should be enough wire for you to do this, but if not, you can always wire up your own using PV wire and the provided MC4 connectors. Remember that on the last panel of a row, you'll need to install end clamps. If you left your rail long here, this is the time to trim it off. You can use the circular saw with that higher tooth count blade, and you can even just run the foot of the saw right against the frame of the last panel to get perfect cuts. Make sure to always wear safety glasses when making the cuts because they're going to throw a lot of metal splinters into the air. You may also want to spray the rails with some WD-40 to make the cuts easier. When you're done with the first row, you'll have either the two loose wires that need to connect to the next row, or possibly one of them that runs all the way back to the solar deck. Either way, this is a great time to double check your serial numbers, your stickers, inverters, optimizers, loose wires, zip ties, and anything else, because right now the top of the bottom row is more accessible than it will be ever again because you're about to cover that up. If the alignment looks good still, the second row should be pretty easy. The second row is super similar to the first, except for that now you get to sit the panel onto the bottom row, which makes things even easier. Try to keep your gaps in the same area and keep your ends aligned between rows. Remember your checklist and keep working through the panels. When you reach the end of a string or a group and need to run the PV wire or trunk cable back to the solar deck, remember to tuck it into the rails and keep it tidy and zip tied down. As you move from row to row, you're going to encounter areas with just one or two panels by themselves. Now these are treated just like any other row. Just be aware of diagonal wires and where your first and last panels in a group might be. The last panels in the install are often the trickiest, especially if your solar deck is covered up in the middle of a row, which is pretty common. You can make all of your connections first and then work the final row to the end, but it might be just as easy to end in the middle, which is what I did. When you end in the middle, you have to put your final mid clamps into place by taking them apart, putting the bottom sections of the clamps in first, and then driving the bolt in after the panels are in place. Now this can be pretty tricky, but it is totally doable. I actually finished all of ours at about 10 p.m. by the light of my impact driver, but it worked out great. Before you cover up the solar deck, you're also going to want to make sure that you have secured it to the roof using M1 sealant all the way around the underside. There's even a little groove that shows you where to place it. You can drive the included screws into the roof and connect all of your wires. You might need to drill several holes into the roof within the sealed off area, or you may end up just doing one larger hole. In either case, make sure to be very careful as you connect each wire to your traveler wires that go from the solar deck through the attic to the inverter, which is often in a garage. In my case, I used metal cased wire, as you know, but a lot of folks will just be pulling Romex for this. All connections in the box should be made and should be secure, including connecting all grounds to the bus bar. You can then put the lid on it and screw it tight. After you're done putting all of the panels in and you have the solar deck buttoned up, it's a good idea to do a final check that everything is level and that all of your clamps are tight and all of your end caps are in place. Once you're sure that that's all set, it is time to focus on the ground portion. Hallelujah. I remember feeling a definite sense of relief once all of the panels were up on the roof. My garage is air conditioned, so that made a huge difference on the work going forward. At this point, you should have a set of wires coming down into the garage as well as the Ethernet cable to connect to the CCA if you're using optimizers. Our next job is to install the junction box up at the ceiling. You're going to likely find it easiest to drill the holes in this box on the ground and then mount it to the ceiling. In my case, Solar Wholesale provided a large liquid-tight tube and fittings that I could use to run the provided THHN wire sets from the ceiling junction box down to what's called a gutter box. So let's get these bottom pieces set up so we can get ready to start connecting things. I have a 4-inch foundation wall in my garage, so I decided to just keep the battery on the ground and use the leveling feet to make sure it's level. I could then assemble the gutter box and get the measurements to determine where my inverter, which is called the FlexBoss 21, should be mounted. I then followed the instructions from the manual on installing that, which basically consisted of mounting this bracket at the indicated location for the inverter to sit on. My garage happens to have 7/16" OSB lining all of the walls behind the white truss core PVC that you see here, so I can basically mount this anywhere and not have to worry as much about locating a stud. That said, the large mounting holes are wide enough that you can usually drive a lag bolt into a stud for this. Once you've got it mounted, there are also 2 clips on either side that provide additional support. With the battery in place and the inverter mounted, I could now install what's called the gutter box. Now the gutter box's job is basically to allow all of the wires from the roof, plus all of the wires between the battery and the inverter, to be routed where they need to go without being exposed. Think of it like a junk drawer in the kitchen. Lots of useful stuff in there, but it's usually ideal if it's closed so nobody sees it. There are holes in the gutter box that align perfectly with the holes in the battery and the inverter, but in my case I had to actually use one large knockout toward the back since my battery stuck out further from the wall than the inverter did. It actually fit just great and lined up nicely. Connecting the battery to the inverter is one of the easier connections. The battery comes with these huge soft cables in red and black. They have a twist and lock end on one side and they're stripped on the other side. I simply needed to connect them to the battery and then run them up through the gutter box and into the inverter at the battery positive and battery negative terminals. Because these wires are basically made up of hundreds of thin copper hairs, I used a very small hex key to push all of those little hairs into place, and then it required a much larger hex key to tighten the nut down. I also made sure to use the black strain relief inserts that came with the kit. The cool part about these EG4 batteries is that once this is all wired up, if I wanted to add another battery, or 2, they would take about 10 minutes each to add, which is pretty fantastic. With the main wires connecting the battery to the inverter, I'm now ready to provide some communication between the two. I can use the included Ethernet cables to the comms port on the battery, to the lower right port on the inverter, and the battery port on the battery to the upper left on the inverter. This lets the two talk in both directions. And that's all I need to do as far as wiring those two together. Next up, we need to figure out where the grid boss is going to be mounted on the opposite side of the wall. Now, since my house's service panel or main service panel is just a couple of feet away on the outside of the house, it made sense to keep the grid boss near that since its job is to handle the power and communication between the inverter or the battery and the grid. I did some measurements to determine where I could safely mount the grid boss outside, just so I don't run anything in the way of it later on. It's up to you if you want to mount the grid boss now or to wait. Next up, it's time to connect the solar panel wires to the inverter. This is, in many ways, the funnest part. We're finally about to convert all of that DC power into usable AC power. To do this, we run the included 10-gauge THHN wire from the ceiling junction box down to the gutter and then up to the inverter. We then taped up 4 sets of red and black wire with the THHN plus 1 green ground wire. To make life easier down the road, I recommend taping these up in pairs as well on both ends, or labeling them with a marker so we know which red goes with which black. Once that was done, we bent the green wire into a loop so that it wouldn't get snagged on the lips of the end. We could then wrap it all together and push it up from the bottom to the top, which went pretty smoothly. We now have our 4 pairs of THHN plus our ground on both ends. So be sure to put wire nuts on at least one of each pairs of the wires down at the bottom of the pipe so that we don't run the risk of anything touching something that it shouldn't, causing arcing or sparks or anything like that. Depending on if you're doing this next part while the sun is out or not, you're going to want to be super careful with the wires coming down into the junction box. They may very well be powered. If they are powered, they're going to be carrying hundreds of volts of DC power, which can be extremely dangerous. I recommend keeping wire nuts on each wire at all times, and if possible, try doing this next part at night when there's no power coming through. If not, at least do everything one wire at a time so there's no risk of touching a positive and negative together or to anything else. You can connect the red or white wires from the panels to the newly run red THHN wires and the black wires to the black wires as well. All of the grounds from the roof should attach to the one green ground THHN that you just pulled up. I highly recommend adding red electrical tape to your positive wires if they weren't already red, like you see in my case here. Once you have all of the wires connected inside the junction box, you're good to put the lid on the box and seal it up. Down below, in the gutter, you can now run the pairs of positive and negative wires in through the gutter and up to the inverter at the PV input terminals. Remember that everything has to be securely brought in through the knockouts using strain reliefs and appropriately sized fittings. Carefully connect each positive and negative one at a time to the PV input terminals and land any ground wire at the ground bus bar. Once that's done, the only thing you still need to do between the panel wire and the inverter is to secure the liquid tight pipe with brackets to secure it within 18 inches of either end and every 4 feet along the way. We're now ready to install the grid boss outside and prep for running wires to it. I used a 2-inch masonry bit to drill through the stucco and then a 2-inch wood bit to drill through the OSB cladding underneath. With that knocked out, I used a longer, skinnier pilot bit to pierce a hole into the inside wall so that I could then see from the inside garage where that hole was. I used that same 2-inch wood drill bit to drill the rest of the hole and then made sure I could fit a larger pipe through there without any issues. I then used the gray electrical PVC pipe to connect an LB on the inside of the garage to a length of pipe and then an LB on the outside to connect that end to send another pipe right up into the grid boss. Once I had that, I used the template that came with the grid boss to mark where the lag bolts needed to go. I then used a 5/16 inch masonry bit to drill the holes through the stucco and then a 5/16 wood bit to drill the holes through the OSB. My goal here was to avoid any cracking of the stucco that might occur. So I then drove some small lag bolts through the mounting bracket and into the house. I then mounted the grid boss to the bracket and checked to make sure the LB lined up with the knockout still, and yep, everything looked great there. I proceeded to knock out the hole for the wiring and inserted an adapter from smooth PVC to male threaded pipe and used a nut to secure the whole thing on the inside of the grid boss. From there, it was just a matter of measuring and cutting the new pipe and then gluing it into place. So it was now time to connect the grid boss to the main service panel. As I mentioned here, I had enough of the 1 1/4 inch liquid tight pipe left over that I wanted to use that to make the connection. It's really easy to work with and obviously super flexible, which was ideal. I knocked out a hole at the bottom of the MSP, or main service panel, and connected that side up, then ran the pipe and cut it to length and connected it to the grid boss. It went pretty smoothly as I was then able to use the brackets to secure it all in place. That said, inserting the fittings into the end of the liquid tight is no simple process, I have to say.
Nope. Oh boy.
With the pipe in place, I was ready to feed the new wire through it to connect the grid boss to the main service panel. I fed the included 6-gauge wire in, just like I had done inside, by wrapping all of the wires together and putting a loop in the front to help slide it through. In this case, I had a black, a white, a red, and a green wire to feed through. Now they represent the 2 hot legs of the circuit plus the neutral and the ground. I used some wire lube by Klein Tools to help get them through, and it worked out just fine. With the wires coming into the main service panel, it was time to turn the power off to the house and then to move some things around in the main service panel. My previous solar system breaker had been placed directly above the 150 amp main breaker for the house. And this is not ideal because of the risk of heat buildup. Ideally, you want to put your solar breaker as far away from the grid breaker as you can. With that in mind, I turned the power off to the whole house, which essentially makes the whole panel much safer to work in. I then rearranged some breakers so that the EV charger was next to the 150 amp main and the 90 amp solar breaker was all the way up at the top, as far away as possible. In my particular case, I decided to connect my garage sub-panel directly to the grid boss, so I was able to remove that from the service panel breaker altogether and just run that wire through the main service panel and down into the pipe that we had just added. I won't go much into the details there because that's pretty specific to my situation. Next up, I was ready to connect the flex boss on the inside to the grid boss on the outside. The schematics called for the use of 3-gauge wire here, which, once again, was provided by Solar Wholesale. I connected the red, white, black, and green wires to the flex boss first on the grid connections, as well as the neutral and ground bus bars. Then through the gutter, then through the two LBs and into the grid boss outside. Outside in the grid boss box, we then needed to connect the wires from the flex boss into a 90 amp circuit breaker that we inserted into the hybrid inverters area. The 90 amp circuit breaker receives the two hot legs, the red and the black, while the neutral and ground wires get landed onto their respective bus bars. We could then hook up the main service panel wires to their respective bus bars as well, plus the two hot legs to the grid terminals. In my case, I also needed to connect the wires from my garage sub-panel to the backup loads terminals, which I did. Back here on the inverter, there's still something we need to connect, and that's our CTs. So we've got these guys that came with the box, and we just need to make sure we put them in the right place. Goes up into the CT1, CT2 port, right there. So we've got our CT1 going to black, and then our CT2 around the red up here. Next, we need to connect the flex boss to the grid boss with the Ethernet cables so they can talk to each other as well. To do this, I drilled a 3/4 inch hole through the wall and fed two 10-foot white Ethernet cables through. The ones that came with the kit weren't really long enough for my scenario, so I bought these white ones that are flat, and they're also outdoor rated, and I used those instead. I ran them through the wall and secured them with a flat wire clip, which I also purchased online. I like how clean it all came out here. These two cables connect to the parallel ports inside both boxes, but the left port on the flex boss connects to the right port on the grid boss and vice versa. With the Ethernet cables and PowerNet cables all in place, we're ready to test everything out. This was very exciting for me, but I realized that I had no idea how to work the battery or anything else at this point. So I decided to turn it all on and make sure it was at least working. To my relief, everything seemed to be working as it should. The inverter and the battery are now talking, and I could quickly see the battery starting to charge from the solar panels. This is awesome. All right, one of the only things left was to make sure the Tigo optimizers were tracking all of the panels and their output. I was able to use the Tigo app on my phone as well as their website on my computer to go through that process. I essentially had to draw in a map of our panel layout and then assign each panel to a serial number using the cardboard sticker map that was so painstakingly filled out. With the CCA connected to our Wi-Fi, we were then able to see what kind of output we were getting from each panel. Now this is where we ran into a major problem. One entire string of panels appeared to be outputting nothing. After testing both above and below, I determined that the optimizers were, in fact, reporting back accurately. We were getting no power from one of the 4 strings. No! This was pretty disappointing because it meant that we were likely going to have to go up on the roof again and start removing panels to figure out what the issue was. So that's what I did. I had to go on the roof, remove the affected panels one at a time, and test the voltage from each section. I found out that there was a loose connection that I had somehow missed. Now, this is another reminder that we really need to double check the connections and our checklist after every panel because it'll help us to avoid situations like this. Now, it wasn't that big of a deal in the end, but it was nice to have it out of the way now. So there we have it. Between the Tigo app and the EG4 app, I can see on any device exactly how my power output's coming along. My battery so far has never been lower than 86%, which is awesome, and at most nights it only goes down to about 91%, which means we've got plenty of battery to run the house. The panels provide plenty of power all day, and the battery has plenty of juice to get us through every night and then some. I currently have 2 electric vehicles that we charge exclusively at home, and we keep our inside temps nice and low because it's all paid for by the sun. I love it. Just a reminder, what you see here is just one type of solar implementation that you can do. In my course, I'll walk you through several types of installs of varying costs and complexities so that you're sure to find one that matches what you'd want in your house. I'll walk you through every step and show you all of the tips and tricks that the professional installers use to make it faster, easier, and longer lasting than most DIYers would ever be able to do on their own. Use the QR code on screen or the link in the description to check out our DIY solar installation course today. I plan on doing a follow-up each year to let you know how the system is holding up and whether or not we have any issues. I'll also be sharing my power bills and energy production data so you can see exactly how much money the system saves me and how it performs through the cold and snowy Utah winters, as well as our unpredictable shoulder seasons of spring and fall. If you made it this far in the video, thank you so much. You are a true trooper. And please comment with the words "powered by the sun" to let me know you finished and made it this far. If you want to learn more about the basics of how solar works, I've put together a video that shows exactly that, which you can check out right here. I'm Nils with Learn to DIY. Thanks for watching.